Hello and welcome back to Book, Body, and Beyond. My name is Ross. Today is Wednesday. Hope your week's going well so far. Today we are getting into probably one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, at least top 5, and it can be found in the book of Job. To find the book of Job, you'll just split your Bible right down the middle, which should take you approximately to the book of Psalms. Job is just before the book of Psalms. In particular, today we're in the 38th chapter. Verses 31, 32, and 33. So starting in verse 31, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Technically it is Orion, but that's annoying. I'm going to pronounce it Orion because that's how most people pronounce it. Canst thou bring, this is verse 32, canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Verse 33 says, knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? So this is God talking to Job, and we'll get into the actual characters and stories of the Bible once I go through all my favorite verses, because Job it's a fascinating story. But let's start in that 31st verse where we're talking about sweet influences. So the difference between astronomy and astrology are those interpreted influence. So of course, we're talking about astrology here in the 31st verse. And in this case, we're talking particularly about the sweet influences of the Pleiades. So the Pleiades is a star cluster, also known as the Seven Sisters. It seems like every ancient culture had their own version of what they called the Pleiades. But it's an asterism located just above the shoulder of Taurus the Bull. Today, you might know it by its Japanese name, Subaru. So on average, this particular star cluster is 444 light years away from planet Earth. And if you're not familiar with what a light year is, like myself, I had no idea how far a light year was. It's about 6 trillion miles. So what this verse is telling us is that there is a star cluster located in the constellation of Taurus that is 444 light years away. If we take that times 6 trillion, we end up with 2.6 quadrillion miles away. And it has a sweet influence on us. Many scholars believe that the book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. And one of the reasons I believe that to be true is approximately 4400 to 2200 BC, we were in the age of Taurus. So this asterism, this star cluster, would have been rising on the vernal equinox. So picture our ancient ancestors on March, well, they didn't know March 21st, but our equivalent of March 21st, the vernal equinox. They face east, they're looking at the horizon, and they see a star cluster known as the Pleiades. Maybe they called it the Seven Sisters, whatever they called it, but they saw that and realized that spring would be right around the corner. That's a pretty sweet influence. After a long, dark, cold winter, that's about as sweet as it gets. Continuing here in the 31st verse, we have the bands of Orion. We call that Orion's belt. And then in verse 32 is where things get really interesting, because we're talking about the Mazzaroth. That's a Hebrew word for the 12 signs of the zodiac. And I find it funny that a Hebrew word, it wasn't translated over to English. I think that's funny. Like they came across it and realized, okay, we've got this Hebrew word Mazzaroth. How are we going to translate this to English? And they just didn't. And then Arcturus, that's the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. That can be found in the Boötes, call it Boots if you want. Boötes constellation, which is actually a deacon constellation of Virgo the Virgin. And then that 33rd verse is basically just saying, can you take that which is above and apply it to that which is below? It's kind of the Old Testament version of in earth as it is in heaven. It's also an ancient Hermetic principle of as above, so below. So there is Job 38. Coming up next, we have the next book, which is the book of Psalms. Looking forward to it. See you next time.